after having the privilege of serving on the senior staff at both Willow and Saddleback, I just learned a lot, both in life and in leadership from, those two icons. I actually am in a studio that is Rick Warren's personal studio that I'm shooting this from. And yesterday I was at the Leadership Summit with Bill Hybels shooting a clip from the the nosebleeds in the worship center that I remember, that is like 7,200 seat auditorium that had 9,000 people in it at the Leadership Summit, that I remember walking through that when that was just dirt. And then a little later when we had to wear hard hats going through there to see that thing all built out was unbelievable, to walk into the other room and to look in what was the old auditorium and to see how tiny that thing felt. But being out there is always like old home week for me. It was just such an incredible ride. But the story of the small group side at Willow Creek had its genesis with Bill and his first, what he used to call fire ring, which is just a circle of friends, the Nancy Beach, the Don Cousins, and the Humble, and some of those early guys that helped launch what was the seeker service model, launch the seeker movement, renewed sense of the ability to see that the church is the hope of the world and a chance to be able to reach people for Christ. But the secondary steps off that was a midweek service, became very popular certainly with them, but then they started to implement small groups of a variety of different forms. The version that I bumped into when I first got involved before I went on staff there was done by Don Cousins and Mark Weinhardt and some of the guys that launched what was the discipleship group model. Some of it kind of really was birthed out of a moment that when Bill gave a message called Little Platoons, it was famous, it was legendary when I had got there. And this sermon series, he cast vision so much, kind of like the Band of Brothers or the Band of Men, that some of those military movies that came through, where you can't do life not only alone, you got to do life in a band of brothers and sisters to be able to help you, carry you through the storms of life. The response was overwhelming. And it basically shut down the small group department as was known. And the way that they approached it then, moving forward, was to have you fill out a 4-page application, take a photograph, be interviewed by a staff member to actually be placed in a group. Once you went to that group, talked with the leader, did it fit? The group talked if they wanted to make it happen or not, and you either were in or not, and if not, then you'd go back into the cycle. Quite a assimilation process. You imagine what it took to be a leader. The model was unbelievable. It was truly Green Beret of all Green Beret systems, and they only had, a couple of dozen groups at the time. The church was still north of 10,000. But the team really had something that was well ordered. As a matter of fact, the staff, there was 5 staff, and one had small group 1 as their license plate, the next one small group 2, small group 3, 4, and 5. It was just an incredible system. But it had great quality, but it didn't have quantity. It had, what was everything one would want in terms of having quality trained leaders before you'd send anybody to them, but it didn't have the exponential potential that you see with other models. But it certainly was amazing. They did go to developing curriculum, which was interesting, called the Walking with God series that they did and published with Zondervan, ended up selling like 2 million copies. Unbelievable series that those guys did. But the next gen of that was when, the guys that came in with the meta church model, Carl George, preparing your church for the future. That's when I first came in with Greg Hawkins and a few others. And what happened in that season was a model we launched something called community groups and other mid-sized groups that didn't have all of the expectation to be a leader and even a member, but it opened up a broader circle for a very large and exponentially growing church. You need both of those systems. At the time, we were thought to be, kind of out there and not honoring the integrity of this system, which I find nowadays I can always tell where a church is at, because when with Lifetogether, we can see if they're way over here, we know they're probably going to want to go back this way. If they're way over here, they probably want to go this way. It happens to us all the time in the churches that we work with. But what was fascinating about it in these days is this thing really just took off, and we went from what was a couple of thousand people in groups or so to what ended up being literally over 12,000 people connected in groups by having different kinds of groups, serving groups that I helped to kind of add the shepherding dimension along with the serving areas. We called them serving groups, or you have support groups, kind of classic one, or the traditional small groups off campus, more life group oriented in the neighborhood. And then we had seeker groups with Gary Poole and those guys. But in those days, there was just a lot going on where it became one of the primary voices of how to do groups in the country. It was an amazing ride. I had the chance for me coming out to Saddleback and then doing the 40-day campaign and the video-based curriculum model, and that just took off for us at Saddleback. And then, we did this with major Christian publishers and what was Christian ministries, and now we've worked with, over 500 of the larger churches in the country doing custom curriculum and campaign that helps connect everybody in groups. But we had never done that at Willow, so Bill invited me back under Greg Hawkins' leadership to come in and share with them what we were doing. And when we were there, got a chance to share with them a little bit of how we were doing what we were doing. So to produce a video curriculum that aligned with an upcoming sermon series was a model that gave you, great, exponential assimilation growth. So Bill said yes. So we set up a shoot. I came out and we produced it, wrote some of the scripts and the curriculum, and worked with the team to be able to write it, and made a beautiful curriculum. He did a sermon series based off the book of Proverbs that aligned with it. It had this series called Lifetogether. It was just an unbelievable campaign. We put like 15,000 people in groups, and then did a secondary series afterwards that helped us net about 10,000. That was one particular season, and it had a great ride. But then, the next season, folks came in that had, an updated, enhanced ministry philosophy. It was Randy Frazee and some of the guys that brought in the table model, which kind of like this had the heart and hope of having everybody come around a table to be able to love one another, do life together, and ultimately reach out into your neighborhood and your community. So we went to a model that was a little bit more like that. While that model was good, I actually worked with Randy and Max out in San Antonio when they put together the model, which was so much fun. It was so sacred, so meaningful, yet it was a little more, it wasn't as transferable across the board, and this neighborhood thing didn't always go with what was the affinity-based model, how people had formed groups before. So it was a little complex at times, but it was a beautiful model. That was one particular season. When you have those two models coming in, then you tend to not get as much momentum, or you tend to lose a little of the steam of whatever model. So then kind of backed off the gas pedal a little bit and put a little focus on other things. But now they're in a new mode, and they've got new leadership and a renewed call to want to take this to the next level. And so a guy that I hired, of the 50 or so people that I hired when I was out at Willow with Greg Hawkins and Donahue, we had a couple of guys that we brought from Campus Crusade for Christ that understood discipleship and evangelism, brought in guys from different ministries that had really done small groups at a, kind of a really high level, and that gave us, along with the people that we had hired that were from within. But in this next season, building on the past of what Greg Hawkins and Bill Donahue and the rest of the team, where we were able to recruit about 50 plus staff that ran the small group ministry. Bill Hybel's known to be very conservative and Dutch. On the other hand, knows a good investment when he sees it. It had a great way to be able to not only connect people, but when people feel connected, they feel known, heard, loved, they serve more, and they give more, especially those that lead. The Reveal study showed that those that are actually leading give even 30% more. Ed Stetzer and others are proving this model, and thus churches are willing to invest in not only connecting people and caring for them, but also to recognize it's a great way to kind of stabilize the overall giving, the weekly tithes and offerings of a congregation, kind of a side benefit, but one nonetheless. What's happening now is Rick Schertz, one of the guys that we hired when I was there to be one of the community leaders, has come back and has joined Bill and has had a lot of experience out in the field, and is now bringing a whole new model. And he's in charge of midweek services and what is the section leader strategy that was brought in by the team to be able to take the weekend services and try to build consistency in the different sections across the campus, or throughout the services and within the services. So you have the balcony folks trying to develop and launch groups out of it, develop a sense of community for those that are coming, at the 9 o'clock at a certain time in the middle of the worship center, to try to get them so that they're connecting a little bit. And they host mid-size events for these guys, and hired part-time bivocational folks to be able to care for what is the different sections in the congregation. They actually have still to this day about 50 or so people that are doing that. But when I got a chance here recently to catch up with Rick to talk about where they're going to go, he's got a lot of emerging ideas, because with midweek services and with what is the small groups that are out there, with what is the section leader strategy and what is some of the other models that he's got for discipleship, he's really evolving and thinking about, what God has next. I caught up with him and was able to do an interview. You'll see that extended interview down below that I had with Rick. To be able to see what God is doing is looking like it's a completely new emerging thing. When I was just out at the Leadership Summit, we sat down with him and his team. We talked about where he's going this fall. So he's going to do several different alignment strategies, kind of like some of the things like Rick has done that align with the weekend service message. This fall, they're talking about taking a series that is based off the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And it's an 8-week series that Bill is teaching some on the weekend, and the rest of the team is kind of teaching. So they're getting the best of that model. Only this time they're beginning with the end in mind of actually doing better to sustain that which we started during the season during Wiser Together. Because in the Wiser Together campaign, while we had such a great response, without a solid follow-up, you lose a lot more than you need to. The next year, they did launch a second campaign 1 year later called Praying Together, based off his book, Too Busy Not to Pray. So they saw the benefit of it, but this time Rick's coming in and trying to fill those gaps to make sure that they're able to start and sustain and then strengthen them and ultimately spiritually reproduce them. So it's kind of fun to see where Rick's going, the team that he's building. They're hiring a few more staff. It's sacred to me because being back there and meeting with them after the Leadership Summit, it means so much to be able to have the legacy continue. And even to integrate the legacy of not just seeing people get connected in community, but helping those communities reach their community for Christ. To have the best of seeker and leader in what is their small group strategy is a really exciting future. So anyway, just to kind of a little update to see what they're doing out at Willow Creek. You could take a look at some of the examples of the things that we're developing down below, but planning on going out there in a couple of weeks and helping them with their upcoming leadership retreat that they're taking away hundreds of people to kind of prepare for what is the fall launch. A great way to be able to take the next step for any church as they kind of come into a fall or a new year. So stay tuned. We'll fill you in more on what God's doing out at one of my favorite places, Willow Creek Community Church.